Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for making the time to join us on this webinar, which we are titling the Corporate Accountability, Human Rights, and the Contamination of the Kafue River. This webinar has been prompted by the recent environmental disaster that happened on 18th February, reportedly, where an embankment holding wastewater from the copper mining operations broke and released more than 50 million of 50 million liters worth of acid and waste, which found its way into the Kafue River. I won't get into too many details about the incident because that's part of the purpose of the webinar to kind of understand what exactly happened. But essentially, the objectives of this meeting are one, to evaluate the extent of the damage caused by the chemical spillage, to outline the environmental impact of the spillage, and to enhance the capacity of affected communities to address human rights concerns and advocate for corporate accountability. My name is Meamande Wamukwamba, and I am the Executive Director at MESDA, and I'll be moderating this webinar. So we have three people on our panel, three great speakers who will speak to these objectives. The first is Ms. Musonda Kapena, who is the CEO of Namfumu Conservation Trust, an indigenous organization working in Zambia to champion the sustainable management of the environment. She has a wealth of over 20 years of local and international experience with forest communities promoting indigenous knowledge systems, sustainable natural resource management, and environmental justice. Our second speaker is Ms. Radia Mtonga, an environmental sustainability expert, a circular economy specialist, also with extensive experience in human-centered research and design. And our last speaker is Mr. Manson Gwanyanya, a human rights lawyer with experience in human rights litigation and a focus particularly on business and human rights and access to justice for the poor and marginalized. He currently works as the regional researcher and representative at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Welcome to our three panelists, and thank you for making it. So I will start quickly with Ms. Kapena. The purpose, I think what we want to know first is what is happening on the ground. Could you provide a bit more insight as to this incident? What happened? Who was affected? What has been done so far and what hasn't been done?
Okay, so I'm struggling a bit with my camera. I just wanted people to see. Okay, there it is. So what's really been happening on the ground is a lot. And I'm glad that you've already spoken about how many millions of liters of acid and heavy metals was, I don't want to say it was washed into the freshwater system of the copper belt, but I just want to say that it burst into it because it was an incident that wasn't expected and it wasn't planned. As such, it came as a shock to everybody, which is why it's being considered a disaster. So what actually happened is that the embankment burst and the water was free flowing downstream. What happens downstream is that people have gardens, people have agricultural fields, some other people actually live by the water. As it is, human settlement is often characterized or selected by proximity to water, to land, and other resources. So what happened is that when the acid spilled downstream, it was a wall of water gushing out. And what this did is that it was running at a particular speed downstream without anybody expecting it to be there. So what happened is the fields were flooded, people were in the field, they just saw this water rising. They didn't know where this water was coming from. They didn't even understand why it smelled funny and why it had acidic touch to it and all that. So immediately it flooded. Some of the crops became muddy because of the residual in the water, and some of the people were stepping in the water. So the immediate impact was shock by the human population. The second one was destruction of vegetation, inclusive of agricultural food. As the water merged into the waterways, it came with a different pH. pH talks about alkalinity and it talks about acidity. And as such, aquatic life like fish and the frogs and the snakes and whatever else is living in the water, including the plant material, died. Most people haven't died, but we don't have empirical evidence on the impacts on humans. We don't know to what extent their feet were burnt, to what extent their hands were burnt, because remember, with chemicals, you can't just touch it with your bare hands. But in this case, people were trying to rescue their cobs of maize and whatever is in their field by touching it with the bare hands. Some reports show that there were some chemical burns on the feet and hands of the riparian inhabitants, but nothing was taken to the hospital to verify that it was this extent of chemical burn and that extent of chemical burn. What some organizations on the ground like Care for Nature and Caritas observed when they spoke to the people is that they had blisters on their hands and feet, but there was no other medical report to show the systemic effect. Once you get burnt on the skin, your bloodstream is also affected. Nobody has looked at that and investigated on what other aspects of that acid has happened. Unfortunately, because it happened at the almost at the point of harvesting crop, people still consumed the feed, the food that was rescued from the floodline. We don't know how that has affected them by going back to the field and whatever. We don't know how that within the system is affecting them, because again, find out who had diarrhea, who got sick after eating that food. On the aquatic life, fish was rescued, not really rescued, salvaged from the water and sold to the open public. We don't know the effects because, again, we haven't had a medical team go on the ground and interrogate what impacts this had. Suffice to say, the frogs died, the fish died. There are reports that a crocodile and a hippo were found dead. Again, we didn't have any postmortems done to ascertain that the deaths of those reptiles and the hippo was due to the contamination of the water. Generally, we assume it was, considering that when an organism is used to drinking water or living in water at a certain pH, that's what it's acclimatized to. The other impacts are that we have had a lot of soil contamination, not sure if any tests have been done. So all these are impacts which have happened, but nobody has really looked at the scientific impact. What we are seeing is the observable impacts of this died and that was washed away, but we don't know the residual effect of the acid in the soils, acids on the forests around the waterways. Suffice to say that at the point of contamination, when it happened the same day and a few days after, there were reports of farmers downstream that were reporting deaths of fish. So some people say it was traveling at about 100 kilometers per day, but we don't know for sure because there was nobody testing at every point to see how fast or how slow it was going. Some of the responses by CBOs and NGOs like Publish What You Pay, Caritas, and a few others is that the impact needs to be done. ZEMA, I think, went on the ground. They made statements, but without empirical evidence. Empirical in the sense that we needed a scientific approach to actually measure and hold people accountable for the amount and extent of damage. ZEMA was there, DMMU was there, a few other government agencies were there, but mostly we received rhetoric statements this has happened, we are going to do an impact assessment. But in most cases, we haven't had a rundown of what impact assessment parameters would be looked at. Is it the human impact? Is it the soil impact, the water impact, and what solutions can be done? We know that the Zambia Air Force was sent in and they sprayed lime. But remember that if it's not backed by a scientific approach, you don't know how much lime to put into the water. You don't know what the lime will do. Is it only neutralizing the pH? What happens to the heavy metals that were also part of the tailings dam? How do we remediate that? Is it through spreading of the lime and other chemicals? Remember that the whole biodiversity of the river is affected. We don't know to what extent bioplankton has been destroyed. We don't know how many fish species were really susceptible to the acid and the change of the pH. We don't know the residual and systemic impact of the fish that did survive, if any did. What have they ingested to an extent that when humans and other animals eat the fish, how will that spread into the food cycle? It's not only humans that eat fish and eat the vegetables around the river source, it's other organisms as well. So if the cows eat the grass, which has been contaminated by the acid and the heavy metals, when humans eat the cows, will we then bioaccumulate it into our system? Then 5 years from now or 2 years from now, we start discovering abnormalities in childbirth or blindness and other human impacts. So some impacts observable have been seen already, but what about the medium term and long-term effects that we may not know about because we haven't really approached the situation in a strategic manner? Suffice to say that on the part of government, they have done their role, but we need to sit together and agree on what parameters we'll be looking at. If there's an independent investigator, what parameters are they looking at? And is it a joint effort so that even that grandmother in that village will know that the groundnuts they salvaged from their field are not safe to eat? And if they did eat it, what can we do to help them expel the heavy metals, especially out of their system and the systems of their family? So in a nutshell, we've had the government response so far, we've had public health responses, we've had DMMU responding by giving alternative food. But is that food enough to take the communities through the period that their crops, the ones that they have lost, would have taken them through into the next growing season? Sometimes I'm the boss, so I'll stop here before I start entering anybody else's spaces. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Something interesting that you've already shared. I forgive my ignorance, but even when you read about these things, especially if you haven't lived on the copper belt before, and you hear that there was an acid spill, I don't know whether I was expecting it to be like green stuff spilling, 50 billion liters of green stuff. So I think it was interesting for you to share that it looks like water, but then it's contaminated. And that in itself is risky, because if I'm thinking that there are people who are not educated, who are not learned enough, who will look at that water and think it's consumable, they can try and drink it. I think in many of the communities we've seen children playing in these pools, trying to swim in these pools. So, just understanding, I think, first of all, that the contamination doesn't necessarily come in a way that looks hazardous on the face of it. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And all the more reason to be more careful. We'll move to Radia, I think, on this note. You've laid a great foundation, because now that we understand what happened, what exactly does this mean? What is the full scope of the impact of this type of pollution, this type of contamination? Musonda had mentioned like short term, mid term, and long term. So I think that really lays a great foundation right there for you to kind of explain what that looks like for the affected community where the mining company is, surrounding communities, Zambia generally. And, the river flows into other rivers. If I'm not mistaken, the Kafue flows into the Zambezi also. So, and the Zambezi is not just a Zambian river, it flows all the way through to Mozambique. So what is the full scope of this impact, basically?
All right. Thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. I think Zonda has touched on a lot of what the impact would look like. It's not just the area where this spill happens. This river flows, and she's corrected something that I was trying to understand. You see, like 100 kilometers is quite far, and there are towns in between, and a lot of things were affected. So the biodiversity, people's livestock and people's food. So these are livelihoods that are affected. Zambia primarily depends on, we have a lot of subsistence farming. So these are people that are growing food to sell, yes, but to also eat. So if your crops are contaminated and your livestock is affected, what happens? How do you eat? How do you send your children to school? A lot of people depend on the money that they get from these activities to support their economic activities. So suddenly you don't have an income anymore, and the government or whoever is telling you don't consume this food and don't sell this food because it's contaminated. As Musonda has explained, I think you're going to eat that food because you're thinking, I spent a lot of money for inputs. It's ready. It looks like it's ready to harvest. I'm going to pull it out of the ground and I'm going to sell it. A lot of us, as we are driving along Great North Road, we see Kandolo and we see all these different things. How sure are you that some of those things were not harvested from these contaminated places? So it's not just the people in that area that will be affected. It's also you that would consume this food unknowingly. Even some of that fish that was salvaged, I'm very sure some of it found itself in markets outside of the copper belt and was consumed. So I think people need to think about these things as the entire Zambia being affected and this not being an isolated incident. I was trying to research and it's very hard to find. Information is there, but it's fragmented and it's very hard to find, which in itself is a problem. I think information should be shared in ways that people are able to consume it at the moment. Not a lot of people consume traditional media anymore. We have young people that are always on the internet and consume news via your TikTok and your Instagram, Facebook, not so much. Why isn't information being shared in those using those platforms? The youth right now have a wider reach than traditional media, and it's important, I think, to involve them somehow, but also involve the community at a local level, sort of condense the information so that the people that are affected understand. You talked about the grandmother. Her groundnuts are ready and she would like to eat those groundnuts. But has anyone explained to her in a language that she understands that she's not supposed to consume those contaminated or affected foods? Another thing I think is water supply was cut off, right? A very reactionary measure, which I think we need to move away from as a country. So water supply in some towns was cut off as they were cleaning this up. This meant that, first of all, you can't drink water, right? You can't drink water from the tap. So people are finding alternative places to draw their water. Already, this is a risk because Now, other diseases, you're not drinking safe water, you're finding other places to drink water, so there's the risk of other diseases popping up other than whatever will come out from drinking the water that was affected by the acid. You have your girl children, you need to bath. I think as a woman, most of us know you need to, for you to go to school or for you to be functional in society, you need water. So there are people that were affected in that manner. You can't go to school, you can't go for work, you can't cook for your family because water supply has been cut off. I saw that, in some places they were being given water and they were being given, is it the drip? And that's already another environmental problem. I'm trying to find the right word for it, because now what you're doing is increasing the use of single plastic. Where are those things being disposed? And that's the problem with the reactionary measures, because we just want to fix what we can see in the moment, and we don't have long-term plans of when people throw away this single-use plastic that we've given them, where is all this plastic going? Back into the river and contaminating it some more. I think the problem is big. I think I could go on and on. Our tourism sector is also at risk. This water is traveling, and there are animals that are drinking from this from the river and from the water. And when animals start dying suddenly, are the people in charge, our game rangers and these people who own resorts, are they equipped to handle such a situation? I don't think so. I don't think so. If somebody has more concrete information or more expert knowledge on this, I think they could share. So those are the problems. Our tourism, just the socioeconomic standing of people, excuse me, is affected. This could even lead to like an increased rate of crime, like a short spike in crime, because suddenly people don't have a source of income. We need to eat. What are we going to do? I think before much like Musonda, I could go on and on and on about how outraged I think we should be, but also what we could have done better. I will give it back to you to pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you
so much, Radia. There's a few things that you said that I think are really important. The first being the fact that we still have a very reactionary approach to dealing with some of these emergencies. And in provinces like the Copper Belt, which are literally about mining and extractive operations, some of these things should be predictable at this stage, or some of these emergencies, and there should be frameworks in place to address some of these things and prevent some of these emergencies reaching this point, even from a planning stage. So how people are structuring their operations, how they are managing their waste from the onset should be in such a way that should there be an emergency, machinery breaks down, it shouldn't ultimately end in the biggest form of disaster, because experts should have foreseen this by now. So I think that's really important. And also talking about how, when you speak of outrage surrounding this crisis, people don't even fully understand what's going on. Neither do they even understand the extent of what's going on and how it affects them. Say those of us who are based in Lusaka, you speak to a few people who are in Lusaka and they're wondering, what has that got to do with me? People cannot be outraged when they don't even understand what the problem is and what's going on. And like you said, I think that's where use of the media and young people comes in, where both traditional and new age media, because the audiences differ, right? So the younger, more middle to upper class maybe can be reached through the internet. But then the majority of people living in marginalized communities still depend more on traditional media. And I think that's something that I guess we can also take away here at MESDA to see how going forward from this webinar, which is a preliminary, discussion, we can now begin to implement activities and engage with the community more around this. So thank you for that. I'll move to Manson. I think this is a great time where we now talk about where to from here. I think you've had a chance to we deliberately wanted you to go last because we wanted you to also kind of be caught up on what's happening and for you to kind of make your own observations around just how there's a lack of concern despite the impact. You have worked extensively in the extractive sector and with around human rights defending in that sector. My question to you then is, where to from here? What can people do? How can they engage? Because this leakage was caused by mining operations of a particular company, right? And like Musonda mentioned, government has made a few attempts to mitigate the problem, but then how do you know what lime needs to be put if you haven't even properly assessed the extent of the damage? So how are we dealing with these stakeholders? How must we handle ourselves as civil society working in this space and activists working in this space? One. Two, how do we engage with the companies that are creating this problem? Three, how do we also now involve the regulator, the government? And four, how do we engage with you as international organizations that are already working in the space, basically?
Thank you very much, Mia. I hope I'm audible. Let me also thank MESDA for the invitation. I appreciate the fact that you wanted me to go last so that I can, I don't know the term you use, so that I can familiarize myself. But I am actually quite familiar with this case. I've just posted a link that I've been working on the past 2 weeks since this incident happened. So we've been following closely the situation. There's also a statement by civil society organizations from Zambia that we also posted where they were calling for accountability, etc., etc. Zambia Alliance, Publish What You Pay, Kafue District Land Alliance, etc., etc. So there's quite a number of civil society that we think have already said something about this. But yeah, I want to do 3 things, Mia, if you allow me. The first thing that I want to do is to quickly just give an overview of what we talk about when we speak about business and human rights and why we think this is important. And I hope this will answer all the 4 questions that you have asked. And then the second one, I'll probably speak to the role of government and the role of companies in all this. Very briefly again. I think if I recall, you have given me 8 to 10 minutes. And then lastly, I want to answer your direct question, which speaks about the practical steps, practical ways in which communities can address some of these issues and concerns. So, and then I believe that in this then sort of gives a holistic picture. My experience really when we speak to people or communities or other stakeholders in general is that they really don't understand this notion of business and human rights. They think that human rights is something that happens between private citizens or individuals. Mia, if I slap you today, luckily you're far away from me, but if you're sitting next to me and I slapped you, there ought to be consequences because we live in a society where we are a civilized nation. There ought to be consequences for me slapping you because it's not allowed. It's against the law. I can't go around assaulting people as I please and as I wish. Now, the worrying part is that when you demand the same consequences or actions from companies, people tend to act confused. Like, no, but you can't do that, etc., etc. So when we speak about business and human rights, we are literally calling for the same consequences. If I steal something, I must be arrested, I must be tried, I must be sentenced to jail. If I go and put poison in your water, something that is more directly to this. If I put poison in your water or in your bowl, let's assume you have a bowl at your house. If I put poison in there and you drink it, and as a result, you and your family either fall ill or you die, God forbid, there must be consequences for those actions. It's as simple as that. It cannot be different now because it's an investor who has done that. So the call and really the business of us as business and human rights activists is to try and show that linkage to say when there's been a violation of human rights, there must be consequences. And Radia spoke before me. She literally listed some, as I was listening to Radia speak, as I was listening to, I think it was Musonda who spoke first. I was literally making notes to say these are the rights that have been violated in this process. Number one, the right to life itself. I'm not too sure, and I hope no one has really passed on from this incident. But the fact that people's lives are threatened in its own is a serious issue. The right to health. And these are not rights that I am coming up with. These are rights that are either protected by international law, and I'm fairly certain to some extent the Zambian constitution contains some of these rights. So if someone has to end up in hospital because of the actions of one company, then they have literally violated that person's right to health, the right to food. Radia spoke about the fact that people who fish there, some of them sell the food, etc., etc. The right to livelihood. Some people fish rely on the fish to sell so that they can feed their families. Now, if you can't fish from that river anymore, literally, I've taken food out of your family's mouth, and I've stopped. I've affected that right to life. And of course, the most pertinent one, environmental rights. You know, you have a right in many constitutions, I believe even Zambia might have those rights, to an environment that is not harmful to your health. So these are rights that have been literally violated by these companies through their mining processes. And there ought to be consequences. And when we speak of holding companies accountable, we are literally saying that the same, not literally word for word, but the same action should be taken. And I can tell you now, if this had been done by an individual, probably someone would be behind bars or, you know, awaiting trial somewhere in the cell. So let's not confuse these things. We are not demanding for any favors from companies to do something which they are not, you know, that they're not required to do by law. They must just not violate people's rights. Full stop. And if they violate them, there must be consequences. Now, let me move on quickly to the role of government and perhaps also the role of companies. The government, as the biggest stakeholder, has to make sure that those rights are protected. So the government has to have laws and have to have put in place mechanisms that ensure that the rights of the citizens are protected. And in the event, unfortunate events like this, government must take action to prevent or to remedy the situation. But also, we are saying companies who have also been responsible for this must be held accountable. But in addition to holding them accountable, they must take the necessary steps to remedy the situation. You would know, Mia, there's also this case where there is lead poisoning somewhere again in Zambia, and Anglo America was being sued, and I think they've actually appealing that case. And really, as the resource center, we are limitedly involved in that. But really, the purpose of that action is to say, you caused this mess, clean it up, right? So in these instances, part of the role of these companies that are involved that have poisoned this river, they have to step up and make sure that they clean their mess up. And government has a big role to play to ensure that companies are held accountable and that they remedy the situation. So those are the first two things that I wanted to do, Mia, to give a sort of an understanding before answering your question. Now, let me try and answer your question on some of the practical things that we think can be done. I have limited my research only to practical things that communities can do. But in all fairness, it will apply to civil society, to apply to any stakeholder, to apply to churches, you know, and any other relevant stakeholder that might find this worthy of a cause. So number one, we think that it will be, even us as civil society, as international organization, it is important to ensure that we help local communities and advocacy group to organize so that when they speak with one voice. So they must have small SPOs that speak to these issues and address them with one voice to say, we don't want this. This is not what we should not accept this. And when they speak out like that, and those things are heard, it's more likely that even the government itself is going to pay attention. We also think it's important for communities to be educated, and in the same vein, they must be able to document some of these things, document some of this evidence of these human rights violations by taking photos, by taking testimonials, by, you know, perhaps even testing the water. I think Musonda, when she spoke earlier before, mentioned the fact that there's no scientific evidence, you know, to sort of back some of these up. So, and you realize that as time goes on, in the next 6 to 7 months, no one has actually taken any water to taste, and more likely than not, the actors who are involved, the companies who are involved, might actually get away with it. So, in the immediate instance, we as civil society, local SCOs, even international, we should be rushing to assist those communities to document some of this evidence, to take the water samples and getting them tested as soon as possible. I doubt that has happened as we speak. I mean, I don't want to be pointing fingers. I'm sure we all accept that the communities, the civil society is really short reserved when it comes to getting money to assist some of these things. But those are some of the things that we think practically, if the resources are there, should be happening already, or at least communities should be, as civil societies should be seeking support to actually do some of those things. The other thing that communities can do on their own is also to start protests, to ensure that they are ahead, engage in peaceful protests, public awareness programs, and campaigns that ensure that there is a spotlight, there's a limelight on their cause, and that someone listens to them. There's also the possibility of taking legal action. And this, like I said, remember when I started speaking when I started giving my presentation, I said some of these things are not only for the communities, even civil society, even stakeholders. There's a possibility of taking legal action. You could have civil society who lead on this, support on this, or even churches, who support communities. As you are aware that most of the communities might not have the resources to even pay lawyers for a consultation. So we think that it will be important to encourage or find creative ways to ensure that there's some form of legal action that happens. Partner with organizations like I know Zambia has the Human Rights Commission. Get the Human Rights Commission involved there. They are constitutionally mandated to ensure that they protect some of the rights that I listed earlier. The right to food, the right to water, etc., etc. So important that if we can, legal action be taken. Important also to partner with NGOs and civil society, collaborate with human rights organizations for technical support and funding. Like I mentioned earlier, that it's difficult in this sector to fund some of these activities if you don't really have financial backing. I think one of the speakers before me, I'm not sure if it was Radia or Musonda, spoke about, making sure that there's media. And these days, when you have a smartphone, a smart device, it's easy to even start a campaign on Twitter, on engagement with social media, and get people to understand or to know some of these things. So those are some of the ways that we think communities can use to tell their stories. There's also local TV, radio stations, etc., that can assist in this process. But more importantly, demand accountability from these actors. There's a term that I've had in many, and I'm about to wrap up now. I think I've been speaking a lot. There's a term that I've heard in many gatherings which speaks to social license to operate. These companies are operating within our communities, and our communities have a right to tell them that, look, if you continue on this path, we are not going to accept this. So demand accountability, advocate for, someone mentioned this term, environmental impact assessment, before these projects happen. I mean, if I'm pretty certain if there was a proper EIA done, some of these things would have been avoided. You could foresee that it's a possibility, and steps would have been taken to ensure that we avoid that happening. The last but not least, is also encourage communities to speak to their governments. The government is there for the people, and if communities demand some of this action from their government and tell the government that we are not going to accept this and we need you to take action, I think to an extent you might find that government reacts faster when communities directly speak to them. Also, the last one that I'm going to speak to, having international networks, which also help to amplify your voice. Like I said, part of my job is to ensure that we keep an eye on some of these things. And our role as the resource center is to amplify some of these things. I sent a link before I even started speaking to say, we've been monitoring this case. We're trying to bring an international audience to it. But there could be more that we could do, obviously, in partnership with local civil society organizations, if there are ways that you think, or anyone listening here thinks we might be of assistance to these local communities, our doors are always open to partner, particularly if we have the necessary resources to take the necessary action. Lastly, like I said, there's a statement that I saw that has been issued by local civil society organizations from Zambia, which is very impressive, which lists some of the things that they are demanding from companies and civil society. And I think it's important that we ensure that this thing does not go without punishment. I think I've spoken for more than 10 minutes. Apologies for that, Mia, but let me hand over back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manson. I wanted to ask because I don't think you even shared too much about the Business and Human Rights Resource Center and what exactly it is that you do. That might be helpful, I think, just for record's sake. That's my first question. And then the second,
Yes.
you spoke about social license, and I think Musonda can come in and contribute on this. I was on the Copper Belt a few weeks ago on this issue of the social license. And as I was doing some sort of assessment within some of the communities, you find that most of the feedback that's gotten is that whether or not there is no social license, whether or not there is or isn't a social license to operate, provided said company has a sort of relationship with the government or a sort of relationship with government officials, whether or not they have a social license is inconsequential. So, it's one thing to say, oh, okay, there must be a social license to operate. But what happens when there's no social license to operate? People are ignored because obviously the mining company, this touches again on the issue of resources, right? The mining company has the resources to pay off. And then also it touches on issues of corruption because you find there were certain participants who reported cases of reporting things to the police. And even as they call maybe a manager of this company, I'll not mention any specific companies, but they'll call a manager of a company and the manager of the company is showing up with some cash in hand or with a package for the officer. So immediately that happens, the officer definitely has a bias. So what happens in these cases when the ideal doesn't necessarily translate to the practical?
Thank you very much, Mia, for those questions. And I sincerely hope I hope none of my bosses are listening, because part of the requirement that we're always told is that before you speak, you must always advertise the organization. You must always speak about the organization. The only reason I didn't do that is I was really trying to make sure that I cover the content, because I think in your notes you had said we have 8 to 10 minutes. But let me do that, and thank you for the opportunity. The Resource Center is an international NGO. The full name is actually Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Short is Resource Center. And we really exist to ensure that we try and hold corporates accountable for human rights violation, and we also try and ensure that there's transparency in everything that corporates do when it comes to the issue of human rights violations. We work in a number of thematic areas: natural resources, extraction, so to speak. We also do labor rights. We also work on information technology, so your digital rights, etc., and about three more sectors. Our role really is to ensure that we hold companies accountable for human rights violation. And like I said, it's a global organization. I've got colleagues in about over 80 countries. I'm their representative for Southern Africa, so I cover Southern Africa, except for all the countries in Southern Africa, except for the DRC and Mozambique, only because of the language. And my daily work involves monitoring some of these violations, writing to these companies that are involved in these violations, ensuring that they respond. We don't litigate per se, but we have partners who litigate. In certain instances, we can then if we think that there's a really a case to litigate, we then invite our partners to then who will then assess and say, look, yes, we can take this case forward, or no, we don't have the resources, etc., etc. But the biggest vision for the resource center is to exist in a world where corporations do not violate human rights. And like I said, I'm their Southern Africa representative who covers Southern Africa. I hope that sort of covers, gives a brief overview of the work that we do. Now, let me speak to the issue of social license. Social license, in my understanding, is really a loose term. But basically, what we are trying to tell these companies that these resources are our resources. They belong to the African communities. And in order for them to extract them, they must have permission from us. And of course, as you know, government is the one that sort of has authority to sign agreements, etc., etc. And I can accept that the point that you raise, Mia, of corruption, and it's not only corruption. Sometimes you find that some of these people who are involved in these companies are government officials. So I'll give you an example for Zimbabwe, where at some point they had a law that you needed to have 51% shareholding of a local. It was called indigenous law. And what companies would do is that they would take a politician and then make them the front of these companies. They are then the ones who are, who are running around and say, no, this is our land, whatever, etc. So it's not only corruption, but it's also this issue of us having governments that really do not want to respect our rights. But the issue is that we must, even as civil society, try and educate communities that there are ways that you can fight this. In South Africa, there's a case that went to court all the way. I think now the Minister of Mining is appealing it in the appeals court, where they litigated and the court agreed with the communities to say, look, if you are going to mine, I'm happy to find that case and even share it with you if your audience think is important. If you're going to mine in a particular area, you must get prior informed consent from those communities. They have the right to say no. So the right to self-determination also means the right for the community to say, look, you want to mine copper here, but we have our tourism industry that is blooming, and we fish and we feed from there. So this issue of you coming to us telling us you have jobs, etc., we are going to reject. And the courts have upheld that argument to say communities should have the right to say no when they feel that something is not to their benefit. So part of our duty is to ensure that we sensitize communities and even not only leave it there, also try and push some of these things, get a test case in Zambia, try and litigate, find a donor who can say, look, we are willing to put $20,000 on this case and see if you can get the cost to agree with you. Last thing I'm going to say, I was involved in a panel discussion where we had quite a number of judges from the African continent, Zambia included. And ironically enough, when I spoke about this thing, the judges said, look, we are even waiting for some of these cases to come to us so that we can pronounce on them. The only issue we have is that our local civil society have no faith in us. They rush to go and litigate in America and UK, etc., etc. So I guess from that engagement, the point that I sort of took out from there is that we might also be guilty of this thing of running to the West for litigating our cases. We must try and push. I mean, of course, it's quite difficult in a number of African countries because of how some governments might have control over the judiciary, etc., etc. But I still think that there is a case that we can put just for trying and see if we cannot move some of those trees, not shake some of those trees and see what fruits can follow from there. I'm going to briefly stop here and happy to answer any more questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. That answers the questions I had asked, and you're totally right. Like, judges cannot pronounce on issues if the matter has not been raised before them. So I think it's also important, and you're giving me a lot of food for thought. And this in itself, this webinar is going to be a resource that we are going to kind of share extensively as we begin to mobilize as communities beyond this. And maybe lastly, before we wind up on the issue of mobilization, I'm going to ask the same question, and I'll pose it both to Musonda and Radia in terms of encouraging communities to speak up, to engage with companies, to mobilize amongst themselves, and to speak with governments. And I'll split this question into two parts, right? how best, because I think the approaches are different. So maybe with Musonda, because you've worked extensively with indigenous groups, particularly we're talking the traditionally indigenous groups that may not have access to internet, may not really have, the middle to lower class to extreme lower class groups. How do you think we can best go about disseminating this information and coming together? And then Radia, maybe you can kind of address this question from a more urban approach to the kind of middle to upper class, because I think it's important we need each other. So while we speak about working with the marginalized, and we also need resources from people that are in the upper class that have access to certain resources. So there's need for kind of sensitization upwards and downwards and horizontally. So maybe Musonda, you can deal with horizontal going downwards, and Radia, you can kind of address sensitization horizontal going upwards, so that we can kind of create a full circle picture as to what our next steps are from here.
Thank you very much, Mia. I just wanted to take us back a little bit. When Kaunda became the first Republican president of Zambia, he already knew the cadastral map. He knew where the resources across the country are. But what we did not know is that the value of minerals is not an African thing. We see gold, we think it's a stone in the ground, we kick it around until somebody else comes to say this is a precious stone. The same thing happened with sugilite in Luapula province. We just thought it was an ordinary rock. So the main thing is that when you look at our indigenous knowledge systems and the traditional royal establishments, they live on this resource, but they don't know the value of it. So the value of these minerals is being given by the West. They find something because of education. They know that the periodic table will state the value of gold, of copper, of all the critical minerals that are now sexy on the global plane, looking at the electric cars and electric gadgets we need to provide solutions to the energy crisis. So I've had chats with a lot of royal establishments, both in Northwestern Province and Luapula Province. And the outcry is that we don't learn about minerals in our early education systems. As such, we follow what is trending on the global platform. If suddenly the sugilite is so expensive, then everybody will start digging around for sugilite. So for me, at horizontal level, I would know the value of gold, but am I able to tell my friend the value of gold, or that the stone on my farm or the one I found when I was cultivating my maize field is precious? Most times that doesn't happen. And what often happens, like with the gold rush in Kasenseli, in Mumbwa, and a few other places, is that when someone finds the value, they cry out and say, there's gold. Then everybody goes there to start panning it and digging up the alluvial gold. So the critical aspect here is education. Do we know the resources we are sitting on? Do we know the value of each resource? So these are very critical questions. And if one member of the community knows, why are we impatient to just rush into digging, which has ended up in loss of life and all that? So if the Chinese and other nationalities who understand the value of the mineral wealth we have are coming in and haphazardly our land is being dug up, what most of the Royal Highnesses have said is that I know it's my land, but that's all I know. I know the extent spatially of my land, but I don't know what lies under my land. So this is a call to the cadastral people, the mineral ministry and all that, to say, your land has this amount. As I said before, Kaunda knew why he covered the national parks, why he used national parks and forest reserves and watershed areas to be protected areas was because under there is where all the minerals are. But if you take a critical look at the cadastral map, the whole country we know as Zambia lights up with minerals. But at the same time, the whole country is lived on by animals and humans and is covered with different types of resources. So it's important to have community education, environmental education, community dialogues, and education in the mainstream for our child and our children to know that this stone in raw form, even if it looks blue or it looks red, is of significant value. In that way, we could then start working with the government all over again for them to do a strategic plan. Where do the mines go for this year? After 5 years, after 10 years, where do the next mines come up? The current situation is confusing the community because now everybody's panning and digging up for gold and sugilite and all that, creating a lot of confusion in the community and leaving the communities poorer than they were because they don't look at themselves as owners of the resource. They look at themselves as scavengers. How many gold nuggets am I able to scavenge from here? So it's not done in a systematic way. And most times the Royal Highnesses complain to say paperwork is signed from the cloud at national level. They just receive that, oh, this person has been given authority to start exploring in this area and digging up in that area. With the Royal Highness people, the communities being seen as laborers, as opposed to being seen as the actual owners, because the land is entrusted in the chiefs and chieftainesses, in trust of the people that live there. A perfect example is what happened in Senior Chief Museli's area. There's a big mine now. I don't want to go into the details. There's a big mine now, and the local people are laborers. They don't even know that that's their resource. They don't even receive the beneficiation of having given up their land and paid peanuts for it in compensation. They just see themselves as gardeners and cleaners and menial laborers when they should be the ones to have been consulted at the beginning to say, what heritage are we protecting? Our natural heritage and the forest and the water, or should we step aside and let the mining take place at the scale that it's taking place at? The thing is, what are they benefiting? Zambia is a rich country, but who really benefits from it? And going forward, based on the critical mineral aspect, who's going to benefit? Will your grandmother and mine have access to drive an electronic vehicle or use a state-of-the-art phone, knowing that the critical component of that gadget is coming from the land that they gave up? So it's a two-way thing. If we know what we have, do we have the power, or are the power dynamics so skewed that I'll only be able to see an emerald ring in a shop and I'll never be able to wear it? That's a simple thinking behind what I think are critical questions. I may not have given forth any solutions, but the beginning is you can control what you know. You can't control what you don't know.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll hand over to Radia first before we kind of conclude.
Sure. So everything that Musonda has said, but also on this side, I think, sorry, you see, at the moment, all the young people and everyone operating on this middle to upper, we are operating from a survival point of view, you know. Even if I'm making a TikTok video, it's for me to, how many followers will I get out of this, and what brand deal will I get out of this, and you know, what's in it for me? I think we need to start shifting back the education to, again, why is it important? Why is it important for you to care about what is happening? Okay. The people that are running the systems right now and people that are running the country right now have sort of worked for what they have, and their time is running out. So whatever is going to remain of this country is going to remain for you to live in. And that part needs to be emphasized. I think our generation, so there's us at this level and the ones that are just a little higher than us are really operating from what can I get right now. We're focusing on building at an individual level. And so I'm not sure who. So I guess the groups of so there are groups of us that are concerned about what is happening. I think we need to band together and emphasize the importance of learning about why you need to care about what's going on. We need to move away from a lot of these get ready with me videos and doing a lot of what's going on in the country and why this is important for you. Our education system needs to change also. I think it's about time that these sort of issues are highlighted and emphasized. And lastly, I think co-creation is very important. So I've also, I think, worked with people on the very end of the scale. Yes, the end of the scale, and co-creation and finding ways to involve them in the decision making. Up to now, in the short time I have been working within human-centered design and research, communities are not involved. They're only involved when the person at the top is trying to collect data to fulfill a funding request. But no one is collecting data to make sure that we are informed, to make sure that we are making decisions that involve us, So I think we need more organizations like MESDA, and more individuals like myself and Musonda to sort of come together and emphasize the importance of involving people in the co-creation system, but also why it's important. I had another point, but it's been lost in thought because I was listening to Musonda share. If I do remember it, I'll post it in the chat or under wherever you share this video.
Yes. Thank you so much, Radia. I'll just summarize what has really stood out from both of your answers. With regard to like the middle going downwards, it's a general lack of knowledge and understanding as to the value of our resources, and that speaks to the presumption that we always have that, Africa is poor, Africans have nothing, and Africans always need to be beneficiaries. It's a whole deep conversation that I think even leads to our relationship with aid, but that's a conversation for another day, and what you have spoken about, Musonda, is really true. We are constantly outward facing, and I think even Manson had talked about it briefly, how there's always an expectation of work, or rather a preference for working with the West first before looking at our resources internally. And I think that preference is really deep rooted in our lack of understanding of what we have amongst ourselves. So, even looking at it from a civil society perspective, as somebody that has been working in the space for a while, what you mentioned, Musonda, is really true, because we do a lot of advocacy and capacity building around governance, elections, which are very important also. But I don't think we do a lot around, even human rights generally, we do that. But in terms of actually helping people understand, and yes, Radia, as you said, we are afraid to be outraged, at least outraged over the things that matter, because we can be outraged over very petty things all the time. But, we are slow to mobilize and show rage over the things that are critical to our survival. So I think that's really important. And like you mentioned, as you now start going upward, young people, our generation, the middle to working class, it's all about branding. It's all about clout. It's all about individualism. this rat race that everyone is in, where it's like, I have to be the shining star, at the cost of community. But then also you need community sometimes to deal with the big stuff. So thank you, Radia, for sharing that. I think that was really important. I'll open the floor one more time before we close. Thank you for joining us. Maybe before we close, are there any other contributions that maybe we want to add as our final comments before we close?
Can I go first?
Yes, please.
Okay, so some of my concluding remarks would be that we are used to being very reactive. When mines are being located, we need to do a proper impact assessment. What often happens is that an impact assessment is rhetoric. We just want all the boxes ticked and we just want to get the investor to start. I like the saying, he who pays the piper chooses the tune. If the developer is paying for an impact assessment, they will skew the results in their favor. But what's happened on the copper belt with the acid and heavy metal spill of 50 million liters clearly shows that the impact was not assessed on effects of a potential spill and what impacts that would have on the downstream populations, vegetation, wildlife, water, and all the other elements. As a result, you said earlier on, people don't know how to react when that happens. Nobody prepared the communities that this dam would burst and acid would flow into the natural surface water resources of their area. We don't know the residual effect. And as such, ZAF did their best. They sprayed lime. But do we have in our education system emergency response, emergency preparedness? If the same happens to another mine, would we be better equipped? Have we learned everything that can be learned from this experience?
Right.
And also the disappointment that we as local CBOs and NGOs and trusts spoke about the impacts of the spill, but until the international community started to speak with us, nothing was being considered as serious. So as we plan for mines to be established, can we do emergency preparedness in the case of climate shocks? If suddenly there's heavy rain and all the tailings dams burst, would we be able to contain that emergency? If we do not plan properly and strategically, if we don't phase the establishment of mines properly, we risk failing to contain the disasters and calamities that come with climate shocks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Do we have any other closing remarks? Awesome. Thank you so much for making the time to share your expertise and share your knowledge on this subject matter. We will make this webinar available. We'll stream it on our platforms on Facebook, YouTube, and all these other platforms that we are on, Spotify, Apple Music, just to keep this conversation running. And hopefully this is the beginning. I think one thing that has really stood out for me in this discussion is how we need to put the information out there in a way that is easily accessible and easily understandable by the masses. So we look forward, us as MESDA will definitely be in touch on this topic going forward, and ideally see how we can even begin to do a bit more work on the ground. So we'll be happy to be in touch with everyone regarding that. So thank you so much for coming and have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.